Good morning, everybody. My name is Mark. I'm part of the marketing team here at MorePay and Natural HR, and I'm delighted to welcome to our webinar this morning where we'll be covering all things flexible working. Now, this is something we've all become a bit more conscious of in recent times to combat employee engagement, recruitment and retention, but it's a particularly pertinent time to be talking about this now, given the new legislation that will be coming into effect soon, that gives employees greater rights when it comes to making flexible working requests and changes the burden on employers in terms of how they have to respond to these requests. So with our expert team today, we'll be covering all of these and more. So let's get into it. So just an overview of the agenda for today. Will be Linda Arrowsmith, our HR Advice Line Manager, will be giving you an overview of flexible working, taking you through some pros and cons, managing requests and reasons for refusal, changes to the law on flexible working and what employers need to know, how to implement flexible working practices, and as well as a live, and then you'll be able to get your questions answered in a live Q&A at the end. If you don't have to wait to the end to ask any questions. I know we've had some keen viewers wanting to get some questions in already, so please use the GoToWebinar question panel at any point throughout the session, and we'll try to answer as many of these as we can during the live Q&A at the end. And also, don't worry if you have to jump off the call at any point today for any reason. We will be sending on a recording for you to watch at your leisure later on today. So just to give you a bit of background into MorePay and Natural HR. So MorePay has been making payroll and HR easy for more than 50 years. But with this year, with the acquisition of Natural HR, we really are a one-stop shop for your payroll and HR needs. And just to introduce you to Linda, who will be speaking for you today. She's an expert in HR and employment law. She's been helping MorePay customers deal with HR issues since 2010. Worked in HR for more than 20 years and is CIPD qualified. So without further ado, I shall hand over to Linda to talk you through all things flexible working.
Morning, everyone. Welcome to today's webinar. We're going to go over the current legislation on flexible working requests and talk a bit about what the future looks like. I'm going to go into quite a bit of detail, so just bear with me. So basically, what is flexible working? It's just a way of working that improves the working life for an employee or even the company for one reason or another. All the employees have right to apply for flexible working, not just parents or carers. So somebody could just apply for flexible working to play golf with their mates on a Friday. That is a fair and reasonable reason for applying for flexible working. The caveat on that is that employees must have worked for the same employer for at least 26 weeks to be able to make this request. And any changes that you make will be a permanent change to their terms and conditions of employment, unless it is agreed otherwise. So if you agree for it to be a temporary arrangement, then that can be reviewed at that point, an agreed point, or if it's something that you're not quite sure about, you can do it for a temporary basis and then review and revert back potentially in the future. Okay, moving on. So under the current statutory process, the request needs to be in writing, and an employee can only make one request in any 12-month period. You've got to take, as an employer, you have to take that request seriously and consider it on all its merits, and the entire process must be dealt with within a 3-month period. Now, historically, the flexible working process was quite prescriptive, and I think when the current version was brought in, it was kind of diluted down to give employers more flexibility. So there isn't really a deadline of a letter should be delivered in this many days and all that good stuff that used to be in there. However, it does say that should be dealt with within a 3-month time frame. So we need to just be reasonable with our processes. Okay, moving on. So these are some of the examples of the type of flexible working request that we would get. So the more common one is reducing down hours to work part-time, or change start and finish time. Maybe somebody's got to drop a child off at nursery on the way to work, or pick a child up on the way home from work. So we can have flexibility in our start and finish times. That's a part of flexible working. People generally call that flexi time, although you could have different shift patterns that employees could fit into to just accommodate childcare or any other care and responsibilities. People also can do their hours over a fewer days, which is sometimes called compressed hours. So you still work a full 37.5-hour week, although you might not work on a Friday afternoon or all day Friday. People are also applying a lot since the pandemic to work from home or somewhere else, which is commonly known as remote working. Or people can request to share a job with someone else. And that's quite an interesting concept, and hopefully can be successful for some candidates. But yeah, they're typical types of flexible working requests. We're also seeing on the advice line people applying for flexible working but wanting to work more hours, which is an interesting concept, but it is something that we have seen. So yeah. Okay, so I'm just going to talk about some of the pros and cons of working flexibly. So it can boost productivity. It sometimes allows employees to play to the strengths. I know if people maybe they're a bit poorly, they're on medication, maybe they work better in the afternoon than in the morning. That would maybe make them more productive when they're in work, so that you get the most out of them in the working day. And also it could help reduce absence, because if you're flexible with how they work, it may be that they don't have to take that day off sick, or maybe somebody's been up all night with a child and they've not had much sleep, and the ability to allow them to work flexibly could mean that maybe they start a bit later, and that they would then be more productive when they come in work and maybe not so tired. It can increase engagement, because people who are engaged generally work harder, better output. Happier staff leads to a more engaged, productive workforce. I think it goes without saying. It aids with recruitment. As a manager, I have at times struggled to recruit, and the fact that we work flexibly and have hybrid working has definitely been a big plus tool in my recruitment processes. It's helped me attract and retain more diverse talent, definitely. Gives you a great reputation in the labour market. Again, that's happened for us as well, because it shows that we're an understanding employer who can, trust their employees to do the work remotely as well as in the office. And it gives people a better work-life balance, because we're spending less time maybe on the motorway on the way in and out of work. So it can reduce recruitment and turnover costs, and it can help people's mental health. So we get a better work-life balance, better concentration during working hours, and therefore improving people's mental health, reducing stress and absence levels. I would definitely 100% agree with that. So some of the cons. Even though it is a good thing, it can be challenging for line managers to manage flexible workers if you're working from home. You're not 100% sure what people are doing. They might be working away, but if it's not easy to see what somebody is doing, that can give you a lack of visibility, and maybe you feel like you've got a lack of control over your employee. There's also potentially a lack of cohesion, because it's difficult for people to work together as a team when they're working remotely, or maybe when they only work in the mornings and maybe other employees work in the afternoons. It can cause a lack of cohesion in a team because people don't necessarily always work together, and it can cause a difficulty in contacting team members, maybe to hand over work and to ensure everyone's on the same page. We might not be able to allow flexible working requests because, in a nursery, say, if somebody doesn't want to come into work in the morning for when people want to drop their children off, it's not going to be possible for them to do the work. Depends on how the job that they do works. So it might not be practical for them to have the request. I think just an example on the advice line I had this week. Somebody who works alone in a kitchen wanted to start an hour later and finish 2 hours earlier, and it's a single post with one person doing the job, and it's impossible to recruit somebody for an hour in the morning and 2 hours in the afternoon, split shift. You know, we are going to try, but we've found it really difficult. So yeah, it may just be that the role just doesn't accommodate the request. And then, as this says, it may impact customer facing teams more. Maybe you're on a telephone advice line, much like we are. And, you know, if you're not there at the busiest time of the day, then it might have a detrimental impact on the customer experience. But what we have got to be mindful of is that people from marginalised backgrounds are more likely to take up flexible working arrangements. So, you know, it's difficult to say no on the face of everything, but we have to take every request on its own merits and make our decision based on the facts. So yeah, there can be cons, so it's a very difficult situation to be in sometimes. So how do we manage them then? If it's such a difficult thing to deal with, how do we manage them? First thing we would do is have a meeting. It's good practice to give the right to be accompanied in that meeting, although not at the moment a legal obligation, but we would generally advise it. And then we've got to look into, you know, how does it work? You know, what do we gain from this from a company? What does the employee gain from it? Is it worth you know, considering and taking seriously the request? And you know, we have to have an appeal process as well. So if we reject a flexible working request for one reason or another, it's always a good idea to give an appeal, the right of appeal, because this will allow us to pick up any potential discrimination issues before we face a claim. As you know, potentially if we don't deal with any request reasonably, we could face potential tribunal claims from the employee. So we just touched on it briefly there, but how do we reject a flexible working request? So there are potentially fair reasons for rejecting it as detailed here. And sometimes it's difficult to justify the rejection. So you have to look into it really carefully. And I know this says it's a burden of additional cost, but it has to be a significant burden. So even though we think, oh yeah, I've got to pay an extra £2 a day to cover this, that's a burden of additional cost, that it would have to be a significant burden rather than a minimal burden. So what we need to consider is these issues in detail, and it has to be justifiable. So the reasons are, to be clear, burden of additional cost, detrimental effect on ability to meet customer demand, inability to reorganise work amongst existing staff and or recruit additional staff, detrimental impacts on quality of performance, insufficiency of work during the periods the employee proposes to work, planned structural changes, or such other grounds that may be specified by the Secretary of State. So most of the things I've already talked about do come under these particular headings. The detrimental effect to meet customer demand is where in the nursery you would need to work certain hours to take the children off the parents to do the handover at the evening. Inability to reorganise work amongst the existing staff. If you've already got 5 people already working flexibly with arrangements in place, and you get the 6th person that wants to work flexibly and work the same hours that other people are doing, well, if them people are not willing to change, then you have got an inability to meet that 6th request. So, you know, at times you do have to reject a request that you've previously allowed just because of the inability to reorganise the staff amongst the reorganise the work amongst existing staff. So it is potentially possible to allow somebody to do the flexible hours and not others. That's a big thing we hear a lot on the advice line, actually. If I let this person do it, we'll have to let them all do it. And that's not the case. That's not the case. You need to assess each case on its own merits, and you have to be able to go back with a good argument to say why you couldn't. And if you've already got one person doing it, and then that means there's less people doing different hours or different tasks, then that is a justifiable reason to reject. So yeah, it's just important to note that these are reasons, but they have to be justifiable. You have to be able to evidence why you're rejecting it, not just put the burden of additional cost. We'd have to expand on that and be a bit more specific. Okay, so this is just an example of a case gone wrong, and basically this lady was a pilot and she asked to half her hours, and it was rejected. And she brought a sex discrimination claim because they'd already agreed to a 25%, sorry, not because of that. They had already agreed to a 25% reduction in hours, but not a 50%. And basically, it was found to be discriminatory because from statistics, women do most of the care responsibilities. So the detriment was considerably more proportionate towards women rather than men. And she did win her claim. And there are other examples of this happening. And it would generally be an indirect sex discrimination claim. And they do tend to attract quite high awards in tribunals. So it is something to take very seriously. Okay, so what's coming next then? So we've talked a bit about what's happening now. There are slight tweaks to this process. It's already got royal assent. And what it's going to do is going to give employees extra flexibility in making flexible working requests. And the main thing to note is that it's going to, from next year, it's expected early 24. And from next year, what they're expecting is that an employee will be able to make 2 flexible working requests within a 12-month period, where they could only make 1 before. There's also going to be some mandatory consultation between the employee and the employer. As I spoke about earlier, all we've got at the moment is a guidance to say it must be dealt with within 3 months. There's no real rules around meetings or invites or anything like that. So there is going to be a bit more guidance on what's expected as part of this process. So yeah, that's something to look out for. And then the flexible working request needs to be dealt with within 2 months rather than 3 months. So yeah, we have to be quicker with these processes. And employees, so previously, I don't know, for those of you that have dealt with flexible working requests before, the statutory form itself gave the employee the obligation to set out how they saw this working for the business and the impacts on the business, whereas there's no right to do that anymore, no obligation, sorry, to do that anymore. They can now just apply for what they want, and then there will be some kind of consultation period that follows it. So yeah, the big change is 2 requests rather than 1, and needs to be dealt with within 2 months rather than 3. Okay, so ACAS do already have a code of practice on this, but they are actually updating their current code of practice to take into account the latest updates. And I think in that, what they're going to include is the right to be accompanied. So at the moment, there isn't too much of an obligation on an employer, but they're going to put that within this code of practice. So it's going to encourage employers to be more consultative, and I think they're going to probably set a bit more barriers, not barriers, it's the wrong word to use, more requirements into a process, maybe a bit like the disciplinary and grievance processes. But it's a kind of watch this space one for that. We'll let you know as soon as we know. So just to cover off what's actually changing in the Act, it doesn't amend the existing grounds for refusing a flexible working request. And contrary to what they were saying previously, they're not going to make it a day 1 right at the moment. So that was going to be a big worry for employers, that somebody can apply for a 40-week working job, 40-hour per week working job, and then straight away at the start of the employment asked to reduce down. That's not the case. That 26 weeks is still, it still stands. And also, it's not going to come in until spring 24. But what we're saying is, you know they're coming in, maybe just be mindful of the changes and maybe try and start to introduce them into your day-to-day working lives already. Just because we know it's happening, so we might as well get our head around it and get it in place. Okay, so this was an interesting statistic we came up with when looking into flexible working. So 42% of HR managers are not tracking the flexible and hybrid working policies. So do you have a flexible working policy? Do you know you have a flexible working policy? If you're one of our existing clients, you've got a handbook, there is definitely something in there on flexible working. Does it go far enough for your business? That's maybe something you want to look at. It will be legally compliant if it's approved by us, but you might want to look at it yourself, familiarize yourself with it. It's just interesting in this survey that 40% of HR managers have had training in supporting teams in a hybrid world, but that leaves 60% that haven't, that are not sure what they're doing. It's just very interesting that people in a HR role in the HR department are not actually fully aware of what flexible working is and how to deal with it. So that's quite interesting. So things to consider. You could consider, like I spoke earlier, about creating a flexible working hours policy. And share it, be proactive, have your idea of how it's going to work, offer it out to the team. Maybe it would meet a need that you already have that you've not really discussed with your staff. Document any flexible working terms, so make sure that you save them on a file so that you can refer back to later, especially if you're going to put an end date on them, especially if it's something that's agreed temporarily. Make sure that your managers know what they're doing. Yeah, people really don't want to deal with flexible working requests. Managers think it's too difficult, and I think they tend to get kicked around a bit and left to fester a bit before people deal with them. Well, as the time frame for dealing with them is reducing, it's more important that our managers know what they're doing and deal with them efficiently. And then any changes you're going to make to your policies, just communicate fully. Not just through email. It's really great to discuss this. Hi, this is what we're doing for you. This is what we're doing for your team. This is what we're introducing. And even if it's not, even if the employee doesn't see it as a positive change, I've seen lots of companies bring employees back to the office after hybrid working, or even not hybrid working, but after working at home for such a long time. And it's always, rather than just sending a communication out saying, right, great, we're all coming back into the office, sit down with your staff, talk about the benefits, talk about what we get from actually collaborative working together. So communication is key when we're implementing any kind of process or even reverting back to previous arrangements. Measuring employees' performance. So if you do introduce some form of flexible working, make sure that you've got some measures in place to ensure it is working, and that you review and you pay people appropriately for what they're actually doing. I've quite recently saw something come through actually on advice. Somebody's reducing their hours down and doing this and doing that, and there's not one mention of holiday or pay. So people don't always think, oh yeah, we've done this, we can work around it, but we haven't thought about how it impacts an employee's salary and how it impacts their holidays. So just make sure you know what it's going to change, as well as the impacts on the work, the impact on your obligations to pay them and your obligations to give them annual leave. And like it says, listen to your people. Flexible working hours, it can change culture for the better, but only if it's well handled. Just make the time to listen to people. And you could do regular surveys or focus groups, encourage informal discussions just to see how things are going. Because if you've got Bob always working at home one day a week and it's affecting the rest of the team, it's always good to know about it and to see, what kind of impact it's having on everyone, not just the person that's working flexibly. And then always review what you're doing. Make sure that things work, make sure it's having the right impact on the business. So just in summary, if you don't have a policy, then please think about creating one. We've got a policy team here who will draft or update any policies, procedures that you may have or maybe want to have to ensure really good work employment relationship process. So yeah, have a policy in place. Flexible working does have benefits for both the company and for the employee. It's really important to remember that it's not just about giving them one employee what they want. It aids in lots of things, like I already said. It's helped me engage really good people on my advice line, and it can help reduce absenteeism and presenteeism. And even though it can be good, it can negatively impact some work environments. So what I would advise is that you review, assess, and always come back for advice. So, have we got any questions?
Thank you very much for that, Linda. Yes, we've been great to see. We've had plenty of questions coming in throughout the course of the session. So I hope your voice hasn't worn out too much, Linda, and you've prepared to answer some of these questions. So yeah, I'll get kicking off. What are the employer responsibilities to ensure employees working from home are working in a safe, secure, and regulatory compliant environment? Is this currently being ignored by employers?
I would say potentially. I would say it's a risk. We all had to work at home in the pandemic, so we had no choice. So you have people working from the beds. Believe it or not, I even had a case where somebody was working on a sun lounger in the living room. So yes, that is definitely something that I think at one point was missed. I think it's very important that we do risk assessments and ensure people that are working from home are working safely and appropriately. And it is a health and safety question, to be fair, and we do have a health and safety team that can help you with this, but risk assessments are the way forward. And when employees want to work at home, some companies will go out and do a proper risk assessment on the workstation to make sure it's as good as the workstation in the office. It's really easy to ignore the fact that people need effective lighting. They need to be sitting in a proper chair. They need to be, they need to have a proper ergonomic workspace. And yeah, I do think that it got missed a lot because of the pandemic and we had no choice. But I think now the pandemic's over, I think it's really important that employers do focus on getting them risk assessments done and making sure that their employees, when they're working at home, are as safe as they are when they're working in the office. And it's not just about safety as well. I know we have More Pay have policies on the security of the work that you're dealing with. Now, you guys wouldn't want me plastering all over, some kind of Subway, maybe, I don't know, I'm trying to think of a fast food chain that have internet access. You guys wouldn't want me giving employment law advice to you in a fast food chain. So, these are really important things to consider. Where your employee is going to be working, what's the security of the data, are they able to lock their stuff away when they're at home as much as they are in the office? These are all really key things to think about and have policies in place. So yeah, I think it is something that maybe got missed at the start of the pandemic, but it's definitely things that you need to consider as an employer. I know our business do. So, I think it's really important that you do get these risk assessments and processes and rules in place.
Great stuff. And next one up, how do we handle allowing some staff to work flexibly and not others, i.e. those who use on-site equipment so cannot do their job from home?
So, so people who can, if you've not got the facility for them to work at home, so some people have got, I'm trying to understand what the issue is here. So you've got some people working flexibly because maybe they've already set up with laptops, remote phones, and they're already set up to work flexibly, where you might have other people that have got maybe a desk drive, a hard drive on a table in an office. And there would be potentially a burden of additional costs to get them set up to work from home. I think if that's the question, then it might be difficult to to refuse it because that cost might be deemed minimal. It depends on the size of your business and how reasonable it is. We need to be reasonable when taking these into account, when taking the requests into account and looking at what other people are doing. So like I said earlier, I touched on earlier, you may already have given some people hybrid working or flexible working of one kind, and then maybe there's an extra person that's come and wants the same. But maybe, I'm just trying to think of why you would allow some and not others. Maybe you need somebody there to answer the door, and therefore you need a minimum of one person in the office. So then it may be that actually, yeah, I do need you working there because other people's working arrangements don't allow for that. But it'd have to be fair and reasonable. We'd have to look at why in a bit more detail. But yeah, potentially we could reject somebody that we've allowed somebody else to do. It's business ultimately. We need to make a decision based on what we can allow, and we'd have to justify
it. Next up, can we trial a flexible working arrangement and then revert back to an in-office arrangement?
Yeah, so even though the current arrangements don't actually specify this, the guidance from ACAS does actually encourage trials where we've got doubts over the ability, over the likelihood of the flexible working arrangement working. Me as an advisor would always say, if you're not sure, give it a go, put a review date on it, stick to your review date, don't let things lapse. The hardest thing to do is if you've allowed somebody to work flexibly and you've said you're going to review it, then you don't review it, and then 6 months down the line you want them to come back to the office, that's going to be a difficult conversation at that point. So if you do have a trial, make sure you review it repeatedly and keep in contact with the employee, discuss how it's going. If it's not working for any reason, make sure the employee knows it's not working. For a lot of employment law issues, the employee has to get on board with what you're saying, and I understand it's not easy and not always possible to get everyone on board, but getting an employee on board, it is part of the battle. Basically, it's the biggest part of the battle. So make sure that you consult with your employees constantly through this process, so that if you do say at the end of a period, yeah, you're coming back to the office, it's not working, they will be expecting it rather than just leave it to fester and then meet them and say come back. That's not going to work, and it's going to lead to difficulties. So just be mindful of that.
And when it comes to the burden of the additional costs, as you mentioned earlier, when it comes to potentially refusing a request, would it be that equipment, recruitment costs, and management time to train a new person would be factored into that?
Probably not. It wouldn't be with the one-off cost that you have recruiting any one person. It would have to be like an ongoing cost. So yeah, you'd be expected to take up the costs of recruiting somebody and the initial training cost. That would probably be reasonable. But maybe if it's going to cost you, an additional sum repeatedly ongoing, then that'd be different. It also depends on the size of your organisation and how much money is coming in and out of the organisation. Larger companies, you would be expected to take a bit more of a hit in the wallet rather than smaller companies. But that's just goes for most things with employment law.
What would you interpret the mandatory consultation between employee and employer to mean when it comes to the new legislation? Would a meeting between them both to discuss that suffice to satisfy that requirement?
Like I say, the ACAS guidance is, I think the consultation finished on the 6th of September, so I've not seen the outcome of that, but I would expect it would be a meeting. Who knows? Well, let's watch this space basically, but yeah, I would expect it to be a meeting at least. It might even be an outcome meeting as well as a meeting to discuss the original request. But think about it. If you have a conversation with your employee and you just let them tell you what they want, and then you go away and think about it, have a look at the books, and then go back and just say no in writing, that's not going to be conducive to a great working relationship, because you've put a list of issues in a letter and not really fully explained your case, and then that's going to create negativity. So it is generally good, if you are going to reject something, to have a conversation anyway. So I would say that would be good practice, rather than just sending a letter out rejecting a flexible working request. An employee should be consulted with. It should be two-way conversation. They should put their points across. You then should have the opportunity to tell them why either that you think it is going to work, or maybe even suggest something different. That's always a great thing to do, because just because you can't do what they exactly want, there might be something different that you can suggest that might meet their needs. So I think consultation is so important. But what that code of practice is going to say, I'm not fully aware. So let's watch this space.
So I'm hoping that we can rattle through. We've had loads of questions coming, so I'm hoping we can rattle through as many of these as possible before quarter two. But the next one up, a member of staff wants to go to 4 days a week for between 3 to 6 months and then return to 5 days. Is this temporary request a flexible working request?
Yes, it's a flexible working request, and it would be their 1 in 12 or 2 in 12, part of their 2 in 12 from next year onwards. So yeah, it's a flexible working request. They've made a request to work different hours or different days. So yeah, definitely.
Are there any risks to employers if they don't keep any documentation around approvals?
I suppose the risk is that you have a change in management. People don't really know. I've had cases where there's been changes in management. There was informal flexible working agreements, but the contract actually says something very different. New employer, new managers come in, and then, well, why are you working the hours you're working? Well, I got it agreed with the last manager. There's nothing in writing. So, I've had that manager say, well, there's nothing in writing. The contract says this. I want them to work this. And then that then causes friction, issues in the workplace. That'd be one of the things. Also, maybe when we've agreed something that's going to be phased over time. So maybe somebody's thinking about retiring and wants to reduce down on a phased basis. So maybe they want to go to 4, 3, 2, and that's agreed by manager A. It's not put in writing. People forget, and then they come and challenge you and say, well, no, this is what I said, and you no longer want to accommodate that. Then you've got a tricky situation, tricky discussion to have. It's all about the employment relationship and having a good working relationship with your staff. If you've not got anything, if you're not clear and no one's sure what's happening, then that's going to cause uncertainty, and uncertainty can cause bad feeling if people have different ideas about what's going on.
We've had a number of questions come in around the point around it being a day one right, because obviously it's not been coming into effect as the law has been passed. But obviously there was a lot of discussion around this sort of in the lead up as it was passing through Parliament. It's my understanding that there isn't like a definitive end date, but there is talk that the government will introduce some secondary legislation to make it day one right. Is that how you see it?
That is what we believe. At the moment it's not coming, and it may be something that comes in the future, correct? But when we know more, we'll get that information out to you on the employment law updates.
So another question here from someone who has had a number of employees asked to be a permanent home worker because they care for an elderly relative, which clashes with their 3 day per week in the office policy. How does this policy weigh in with their legal obligation?
So it would depend on that. You need to meet with the staff and see what their requirements are. So because you care for an elderly relative, it's harder with elderly relatives. But I suppose if we think about it, working from home is not a substitute for childcare, because you're there to work rather than to care for your child. And I suppose the same could be said for looking after an elderly relative. So you're actually working. So how does it help you care for your elderly relative? You know, you are working. Depends what kind of job they do, and whether, you know, whether the caring responsibilities means that they just have to pop in on their auntie on the way into work, and, you know, make sure they've got everything set up for the day, or whether they live on site with them and they're at their beck and call, and we have to consider how it's going to impact the work. In that case, we could potentially trial it. But working from home 100% isn't always the best thing, and there are benefits to working together, which, you know, I feel that, you know, when you work alone in isolation, that's never a good thing. I think teamwork is really good, and that happens when people are together. So I would always try and encourage people to come into the office, even if it's just to get out of that home environment. You know, that's not great for your mental health, staying in the same four walls constantly. So yeah, there are really good reasons for saying no to working at home, but it just depends on each case and why they're asking for it.
An interesting one here. How would it work, say, if we were to flip this flexible working on its head? And so an example here: would an employer need to go through the same process if they were wanting to change an employee's hours or place of work?
So there's actually a more prescribed process for that, and it could lead to it's an entire different topic, but yes, there is definitely a different process, and it's more prescribed. There are definite steps that you need to take as an employer to vary somebody's terms and conditions. If changing a person's permanent place of work, say you were moving them 30 miles away from home and they got the bus to work every day, it could be a redundancy. If they're only moving down the road, then it's a bit different, but it depends on the case and what you're doing. But there are definite processes that need to be followed if you're changing somebody's terms and conditions of employment. If a company is changing people's terms and conditions of employment, take advice.
And another one here: if someone has put in an application for phased retirement without an end date to retire, but effectively reducing hours, would this be classed as a flexible working request instead?
It is a flexible working request, yeah.
And bear with me 1 second, my screen has decided to play with me a little bit. Do we need to consider legally paying or making a contribution towards home working equipment, such as desks and chairs, etc., if an employee makes a remote or hybrid working request instead of the office?
The answer is potentially, yeah. It would be reasonable for, because as the health and safety, flipping it back into the health and safety, which isn't my speciality, guys. So just so you know, they have to be able to work safely. So if you've got people that haven't got the equipment to work safely at home, but you're allowing them to, you do have liability for them to be safe at work, and they're at work at home. So you know, there could be a liability for you to contribute towards them, or risk a potential personal injury claim should they get some kind of injury working at a desk. So it's a bit of a strange one, because the answer technically is, do I have to buy a chair for my employee to sit at home? Legally, no. Would it be reasonable for me to buy one if I want them to be safe in their working environment, and they haven't got one and they can't afford one? Then yes. So even though there's nothing in employment law that says you must buy all their workstation, it is the tools to do the job, and you don't want them to injure themselves while they're working. So it could be that you know, you should contribute towards their home office setup as much as you do towards their office setup.
Well, I think that's us pretty much out of time. I know there's a swathe of more questions that unfortunately we've not been able to get through today. But if anyone does want to get in touch or get their questions answered, then please feel free to check out our website, where you'll find contact details, and you can get in touch with our HR services team and book a demo for software as well. And also, if you're looking for other sort of tips and advice, obviously we've covered the flexible working legislation here, but we regularly update both in terms of payroll and employment law legislation in our knowledge centre on our website. So yeah, it's a useful resource for you to check out at any time. We're constantly updating it. So yeah, we hope you found this session useful. And as we said before, we will be sending out a copy of the slides and a recording of the webinar as well for you to watch back at your leisure. So yeah, hope you enjoyed that, and enjoy the rest of your Wednesday. Thank you very much.